Autumn in Massachusetts arrives with a sharp frost that cuts straight through the glass. At 65, I have spent decades learning how to read the silent language of numbers, columns, and hidden omissions. As a retired forensic auditor, my entire life was built on a simple premise. People lie, but documentation never does. Yet on a biting Tuesday morning last November, the most terrifying audit of my existence did not begin in a corporate ledger filled with offshore accounts. It began right beneath the floorboards where I slept. It started with a sound, a strange, erratic clicking noise coming from deep within the heating ducts, like a mechanical heartbeat skipping every third beat. I assumed it was routine wear and tear of an aging HVAC system, the kind of maintenance an elderly widow living alone deals with. I called a local service company, expecting a quick fix, a simple valve replacement, and a polite chat about the weather. I had no idea that within an hour, my quiet retirement would be blown completely to pieces. The technician, a young man whose name tag read Walt, was down in the cellar for barely 20 minutes. When he finally climbed the stairs, I was standing in the kitchen pouring black coffee. The moment I turned around, I saw his face. It was completely drained of color, tight and ashen, as if he had just stumbled upon something monstrous in the dark. He didn't walk over to the thermostat, he didn't pull out an estimate pad. Instead, he stood by the kitchen threshold, his knuckles white around a dirty work glove. He reached inside and pulled out a single brass gas fitting, its threads coated in fresh shavings. "I think someone wanted this house to vanish," Walt said, his voice dropping to a harsh, breathless whisper. He held the fitting out toward me, resting it in the palm of his hand like a piece of toxic shrapnel. This didn't come loose by vibration. Someone backed it off just enough to create a slow, continuous leak. One stray spark from the pilot light, and this entire place would have blown straight into the sky. I stared at the brass piece, my coffee mug growing cold between my hands. My heart wasn't racing out of blind shock, it was hammering against my ribs because in that exact second, every fractured puzzle piece from the past 3 months snapped into a terrifying alignment. Before I could even answer, protocol took over. In the United States, heating and gas technicians are bound by strict municipal codes. They are legally forbidden from playing amateur detective or handing over evidence directly to homeowners. Walt knew the drill. With practiced urgency, he walked back to the main utility wall, pulled out a bright crimson tag, and wired it tightly to the emergency shutoff valve. A standard red tag, the universal industry sign that an installation is an immediate, catastrophic hazard to public safety. Within 45 minutes, an emergency compliance inspector from the local regional energy utility arrived at my front door. He verified the tampering, took official photographs of the unscrewed coupling, and filed a mandatory safety violation report that automatically pinged the municipal database. The system was moving, but before the paperwork could even dry on the clipboard, my cell phone vibrated sharply against the counter. I picked it up. A single text message glowed against the dark screen, sent from a familiar contact number. "Mom, are you home?" Most people reading those 4 simple words would feel a warm rush of maternal comfort, assuming it was an affectionate check-in from an attentive son. But after spending 36 years tearing apart fraudulent balance sheets, I didn't hear a question. I heard a status report. He wasn't checking to see if I was safe. He was checking to see if the job was done. He was checking to see if I was already dead. My mind instantly flashed back to a crisp autumn evening 3 months earlier, the night the polite facade of my family finally cracked open. My only son, Ethan, and his immaculately dressed wife, Melissa, had invited me over for dinner. Ethan was a high-flying real estate developer whose charm was matched only by his expensive tastes. They poured my favorite vintage, served an elaborate roasted lamb, and smothered me with compliments about my health and my garden. It was all an act. The pleasantries vanished the moment dessert plates were cleared. Ethan slid a glossy leather portfolio across the table, his smile turning razor thin. He needed money, $450,000, drawn directly from the conservative retirement funds and life insurance payouts my late husband and I had spent 4 decades accumulating. He claimed it was for a guaranteed residential development opportunity. When I calmly asked to look at the underlying financial projections, title deeds, and names of his institutional partners, Ethan let out a sharp, condescending laugh. Melissa chimed in instantly, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. Eleanor, successful people move fast. Sometimes you just have to trust family instead of drowning yourself in paperwork. I didn't raise my voice. As a veteran auditor, I knew emotion is the worst tool to uncover a lie. I simply closed the folder, slid it back, and looked my son dead in the eye. If it's a legitimate investment, family should be the first ones to welcome paperwork. The warmth died from Ethan's face instantly. The mask slipped, revealing the cold, entitled desperation beneath. He didn't argue. He just stared at me with pure, unadulterated contempt, the look of a man seeing his mother as an obstacle. Standing now in my quiet kitchen, listening to the hum of the dead furnace and staring at the glowing text message, the truth settled over me. The gas leak in my basement wasn't a tragic coincidence. It was an execution scheduled by blood. A week after the red tag was bolted to my gas line, the digital locks on my life started shifting. It wasn't a dramatic knock on the door or a shouting match across the kitchen counter. It arrived as a cold, automated notification pinging softly from my laptop screen on a Tuesday afternoon. The security alert came directly from my primary bank's fraud protection division. Someone, logging in from an unfamiliar IP address registered in a commercial suburb 30 miles away, had attempted to breach my high-yield savings account, an account holding the core of my life savings, totaling $1.2 million. They had failed at the final security hurdle because of a multi-factor authentication prompt sent to a secondary phone line, but the intent was unmistakable. Someone was trying to pick the lock of my future. I didn't panic. Panic is a luxury reserved for amateurs who don't know how to trace an electronic footprint. Instead, I closed my laptop, walked over to the armchair by the window, and let my mind drift backward to the previous Christmas holiday. I remembered Ethan sitting right there on that couch, casually tossing my laptop from hand to hand while complaining that my operating system was dragging. "Let me clean up the registry for you, Mom," he had said with that easy, winning smile, tapping away at the keyboard for 20 minutes under the guise of fixing a software glitch. At the time, I thought it was just a son doing a favor for his aging mother. Now, looking at the security log on my screen, the pieces clicked into place with chilling clarity. In those 20 minutes, he hadn't just cleaned my registry, he had harvested my recovery email, bypassed my security tokens, and mapped out every secret question required to break into my financial vault. Most people, faced with the realization that their own child was trying to rob them blind, would have picked up the phone, screamed, threatened, or rushed over to demand a confession. But decades of tearing apart corporate fraud taught me a foundational rule: never show your hand while the enemy still thinks they are winning. If you scream, they hide their tracks. If you stay silent, they expose themselves. That afternoon, I pulled a heavy, leather-bound notebook from the bottom shelf of my study, a plain brown ledger with blank pages. For the next 3 days, I didn't confront anyone. I sat at my desk and meticulously documented every single conversational trap, every casual, probing question Ethan and Melissa had dropped over the past year. I wrote down the dates they casually asked about the exact value of the house, the probate laws in Massachusetts, the tax structures of my investments, and the exact wording of my existing will. I turned my own family into a case file. By Friday morning, I was sitting across the mahogany desk of Arthur Sterling, the sharp-tongued senior estate attorney who had handled my late husband's affairs for over 20 years. Arthur didn't blink when I laid out the digital intrusion logs and my handwritten ledger. He knew me well enough to know I didn't panic over trifles. We didn't waste time on emotional speeches. Within 2 hours, a new legal instrument was drafted, signed, and officially sealed. We executed a complete structural overhaul of my estate. Ethan's name, which once stood as the primary beneficiary to my $1.5 million estate, was systematically stripped away. In his place, we left a deliberate, unmistakable message, a single, stinging dollar bill, accompanied by a legally binding codicil, explicitly detailing his deliberate financial sabotage and hostility towards my well-being. The remainder of my estate was entirely reallocated into a permanent academic scholarship fund bearing my late husband's name. I didn't leave my son a fortune, I left him a permanent legal monument to his own greed. Securing the paperwork was half the battle. A woman who knows someone is trying to kill her financially, and quite literally, as my basement gas line had proved, cannot afford to live in a house with blind spots. That same afternoon, I bypassed local consumer contractors entirely and quietly hired an independent, high-level cybersecurity and physical surveillance specialist from Boston. Over the weekend, while Ethan and Melissa assumed I was home knitting or tending to my garden, 2 technicians worked silently through my halls. They didn't install standard visible security cameras that a disgruntled visitor could easily spot, smash, or hack into. Instead, they integrated a completely hidden military-grade cloud surveillance grid. Miniature, wide-angle lenses were discreetly embedded into the architectural molding, providing a seamless, overlapping 360-degree field of view across every entry point, hallway, and the entirety of the basement utility zone. The genius of the system wasn't just that it was invisible to the naked eye, it was its architecture. Every frame of video, every infrared snapshot, and every audio cue was instantly encrypted and streamed live to a remote, off-site cloud storage server located 3 states away. Even if someone broke in, cut my home internet cables, smashed every device in the house, or burned the building to the ground, the data was already gone. It was safe in the ether, untouchable and immutable. I sat in the dark of my living room that night, watching the tiny, steady green light of the router pulse softly in the corner. My son thought he was the smartest fox in the forest, moving quietly through my life, stealing passwords and planning his inheritance. He forgot one fundamental truth about growing up with a forensic auditor for a mother. I didn't build traps to catch people. I built systems so they could hang themselves with their own rope. The invitation to dinner arrived on a Thursday, printed on heavy-stocked card and tucked into an envelope that reeked of expensive taste and desperate ambition. Ethan and Melissa wanted me over for a family meal at their colonial-style home across town. Under normal circumstances, after discovering a tampered gas line and a digital raid on my bank accounts, a mother would lock her doors and never look back. But forensic auditing teaches you something vital about predators. When their first trap fails, they get sloppy. They need reassurance. I decided to walk right into their den. That Sunday evening, I dressed with deliberate care. I pulled on a soft, cable-knit wool sweater from the back of my wardrobe, a forest green garment my late husband had bought on our 30th anniversary. It carried the quiet weight of memory and protection. When I parked in Ethan's paved driveway, the warm glow spilling from their oversized windows looked like a picture of domestic perfection. The evening began behind a heavy velvet curtain of forced smiles and impeccable manners. Melissa greeted me at the foyer door with a theatrical flutter of affection, taking my coat with hands that trembled a fraction of a millimeter too much. Inside, the dining room table was set with heavy silver under an amber chandelier. They served an expensive cut of prime rib, poured generous glasses of vintage Cabernet, and filled the room with smooth chatter about real estate trends. Yet, for anyone listening closely, the machinery underneath the facade was grinding loudly. The timing of their laughter was off by a beat. Their eyes kept darting back to my hands, watching to see if I looked frail, if I showed signs of a woman whose health was failing. They played the role of devoted, caring children, but to my trained ears, every polite compliment sounded like a countdown timer. I let them play their parts through the appetizer and main course, matching their soft tones with unhurried nods. Then, precisely when the tension settled into a comfortable rhythm, I decided to pull the pin. I set down my silver fork with a soft, deliberate clink against the porcelain. I wiped my mouth, looked slowly from Melissa's painted smile to Ethan's expectant face, and let my voice drop into a calm, conversational register that filled the quiet space. I've been thinking about the future lately. The house feels a bit too large for just one person. I'm considering putting it on the market soon. List price around $850,000, and to make things easier, I finalized my updated estate papers with my attorney last week. The temperature in the room plummeted 10 degrees in a single heartbeat. Melissa's right hand, which had been lifting a crystal wine glass, froze mid-air. The slender stem trembled violently against her knuckles, a dark red drop sloshing over the rim and staining the immaculate white tablecloth like a fresh spot of blood. Across the table, the color drained completely from Ethan's face. His skin turned a sickly, chalky gray, the mask plastered across his mouth, fracturing under the weight of panic. For 3 agonizing seconds, neither could find a voice. Their masks melted away, exposing the frantic greed underneath. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat working convulsively as he forced his facial muscles into a tight imitation of a grin. That sounds sudden, Mom. Are you sure you want to rush into real estate changes? Finalized paperwork has a wonderful way of bringing peace of mind, I replied smoothly, meeting his terrified gaze. I didn't stay long after that. I let the poison of my words sink deep into their skin, watching the quiet panic curdle behind their polite eyes. When the evening wound down and I walked toward the front door to leave, Ethan stepped forward to give me a farewell hug. His embrace was stiff, cold, and heavy with sweat. As his arms wrapped around my shoulders, leaning close to my ear, he whispered a sentence masked by the ambient hum of the porch light, a phrase dropped with a chilling finality. "Don't worry about anything, Mom. Everything is going to work out fine, exactly as planned." I didn't flinch. I let him pull away, offered a quiet nod, and stepped out into the crisp night air, carrying his confession wrapped safely in the digital memory of my hidden cloud logs. When I unlocked my front door and stepped back into the quiet safety of my hallway, I didn't go straight to bed. I poured a cup of herbal tea and walked across the lawn to the small, warmly lit cottage next door, where my longtime neighbor and dearest confidant, Ruth, was still awake reading by her fireplace. We sat together in her cozy kitchen, the steam curling upward from our mugs. I didn't tell her every legal detail, but I didn't need to. Ruth had known Ethan since he was a boy. She looked at me with deep, knowing sadness as we talked through the evening's events. Without needing to speak the darkest words aloud, the final truth settled over both of us in the quiet of that kitchen. My children hadn't just grown impatient waiting for a natural inheritance. They had crossed a line where mothers were no longer family. They were simply obstacles standing in the way of a settlement. And an obstacle, in their minds, was something that could always be cleared away. 3 days after that quiet, tense family dinner, the trap finally snapped shut under the cold, unforgiving light of a Sunday morning. The weekend arrived with the heavy, dead silence that only pre-dawn hours in a quiet New England suburb can manufacture. At exactly 3:47, my phone didn't ring with a traditional call. It gave a sharp, clinical pulse against the oak nightstand. The screen lit up instantly with a silent, high-priority notification, pinging directly from my hidden security grid. Motion detected, basement utility zone. I didn't fumble for a robe or switch on a bedside lamp. My movements were as methodical and practiced as a trained forensic investigator reviewing a critical crime scene log. I sat up straight in the dark, swiped open the encrypted surveillance application, and tapped the live feed streaming directly from the basement camera. The infrared feed flickered into a stark, ghostly monochrome of green and gray. At first, the frame was empty, save for the bulky shape of the heating furnace and the silent shadow of copper pipes running along the cold stone foundation. Then, a figure stepped into view from the blind corner near the exterior cellar bulkhead door. It was a man dressed entirely in matte black, a dark knit sweater, heavy work gloves, and a wool cap pulled low over his brow. He moved with the quiet, practiced stealth of someone who had memorized every creak in the floorboards and every hidden shadow in the house. He didn't hesitate or search around blindly. He walked with a chilling, straight-line precision directly toward the primary gas utility line, pulling a heavy steel wrench from his deep coat pocket. With a few swift, practiced turns of his wrist, he backed off the brass fitting, the exact same coupling the HVAC technician had flagged weeks ago. He didn't fumble, he didn't guess, he worked with the cold, methodical efficiency of a professional executioner, setting a timer on a bomb, ensuring the gas would hiss out in a slow, toxic stream, waiting for a stray electrical spark to wipe away every trace of me and my home. Then he stood up straight to check his work, turning his upper body toward the center of the room. He paused for a fraction of a second, glancing up directly toward the ceiling molding where the miniature wide-angle lens was seamlessly embedded. For one agonizing heartbeat, the infrared light caught the sharp angle of his jaw, the shape of his nose, and the unmistakable cold glare in his eyes. The high-definition digital sensor captured every single detail with merciless clarity. It was Ethan, my only son, the flesh of my flesh, standing in the dark of my basement, methodically preparing to burn me alive for a cash payout. I lowered the phone slowly. The screen went dark, plunging my bedroom back into absolute blackness. I didn't cry. Tears belong to people who are surprised by betrayal. Instead, I got out of bed, walked quietly to the heavy mahogany bureau in the corner of my room, and unlocked the bottom drawer. I pulled out a small velvet-lined keepsake box, a box I hadn't opened in over 25 years. Inside rested a collection of faded childhood mementos, a lock of fine baby hair, a chipped porcelain tooth, and a wrinkled piece of blue construction paper folded clumsily into the shape of a greeting card. With trembling fingers, I unfolded the paper. On the front, colored in wobbly, enthusiastic wax crayons by a 7-year-old boy, were the words, "Best Mom in the World," written right next to a stick figure drawing of a mother and a child holding hands under a bright yellow sun. I stared at those crayon strokes in the dead silence of the night, and that was the exact moment something inside my chest permanently fractured. My professional mind, the cold, unyielding brain of a forensic auditor, had done its job perfectly. The encrypted cloud servers located 3 states away were already safely buffering, saving, and locking down every single frame of the footage. The digital chain of custody was unbreakable. The evidence was bulletproof. Legally, mathematically, and operationally, I had won the audit. Yet, as I looked back and forth between the glowing backup icon on my phone and the childish crayon drawing on my lap, I realized the cruelest irony of my profession. You can audit numbers, trace offshore accounts, and reconstruct corporate frauds down to the final penny. But there is no accounting formula on Earth that can calculate the cost of watching your own child transform into a cold-blooded killer. I sat there alone in the dark, holding a child's drawing in one hand and the video of my son's attempted murder in the other, feeling the absolute crushing emptiness of a mother whose heart had just been audited out of existence. The minutes ticked by, like heavy stones dropping into a deep well. Outside, the autumn wind whispered through the bare branches, brushing against the glass like a restless ghost. I remained seated at the edge of the mattress, wrapped in the chill of the room, yet feeling a strange burning heat behind my eyes. For decades, my life had been governed by hard facts, balancing ledgers and finding where the discrepancies lay. I had always believed that truth was clean, that once you uncovered the fraud, justice would follow as a matter of course. But sitting there in the dark with my son's digital confession securely stored miles away, I understood the terrifying truth. Discovering the lie does not heal the wound. It only proves how deep the blade went. My hands were steady, but my world had turned to ash. The sun had barely cleared the horizon when I sent the file. I didn't call emergency dispatch, and I didn't wait until Monday morning for regular office hours. Instead, I exported the high-definition cloud surveillance footage directly from the remote off-site server to a secure digital portal, attaching the exact cryptographic timestamp logs, the digital certification hashes, and the precise GPS coordinates of the camera feed. Within 20 minutes, my phone rang. It was Detective Miller from the regional precinct, a quiet, methodical investigator who had spent 2 decades looking at white-collar fraud and domestic plots. He didn't waste breath on small talk. "We have what we need, Eleanor," he said, his voice flat and steady over the receiver. "The chain of custody is unbroken. The encryption stamps are clean. We're moving in." The legal machinery of the state, once awakened, moves with terrifying, unstoppable momentum. Within 3 hours, a county judge signed off on an emergency midnight search and arrest warrant based on the digital evidence of premeditated attempted murder. By mid-afternoon, unmarked cruiser cars pulled quietly into the pristine, manicured driveway of Ethan's upscale suburban colonial home. The arrest was executed with clean, clinical precision. When the detectives breached the front door to serve the warrant, Ethan was standing in his home office, surrounded by glossy architectural renderings and high-end financial monitors, still playing the role of a successful, untouchable real estate magnate. The surprise on his face didn't look like shock, it looked like profound confusion, as if the rules of the universe had somehow malfunctioned. He tried to puff out his chest, demanding to see a lawyer, shouting about his rights and his standing in the community, but his voice cracked when the heavy steel cuffs clicked around his wrists. They didn't just take him in cuffs. They searched the master bedroom and the attached oversized garage. Tucked away on the bottom shelf of a custom tool cabinet, hidden underneath a pile of clean microfiber rags, the executing officers recovered a heavy steel pipe wrench. Forensic technicians dusted it immediately, lifting clear, distinct palm prints and matching thermal DNA traces. More damningly, microscopic laboratory analysis later confirmed that the fibers caught in the deep threading of the tool matched the dark wool of the sweater Ethan had worn in my basement. The physical evidence locked step with the digital file. Faced with a federal-level conspiracy and a charge of first-degree attempted murder with documented premeditation, the fragile, transactional foundation of Ethan and Melissa's marriage evaporated instantly. Melissa didn't wait for a grand jury to convene. The moment she realized her husband was looking at 25 years behind bars and that her own name was splashed across preliminary asset seizure warrants for aiding and abetting, her polished stepwife facade crumbled into desperate self-preservation. She marched straight down to the precinct voluntarily, flanked by her own panicked divorce attorney, eager to trade everything she knew for a plea deal. She didn't hold back a single detail. She sat across from the district attorney and laid bare the entire architecture of their desperation, turning the investigation inside out.
She told them about the mounting private debts, the predatory shadow lenders calling their phones day and night, the collapsed commercial land options, and the desperate scheme they had hatched together to liquidate my estate before my new will could be finalized. She detailed how Ethan had stolen my passwords during Christmas, how they had tracked my daily routine, and how they had debated whether poison or a gas leak would look more like an accidental domestic tragedy. It wasn't a marriage facing a crisis, it was a collapsing corporate partnership where the junior partner threw the CEO under the bus the second the federal auditors walked through the door. Their alliance of convenience dissolved into a pathetic, vicious public spectacle of mutual finger-pointing, each blaming the other for hatching the plot. And as the criminal investigation widened, the artificial financial empire Ethan had spent a decade fabricating collapsed right along with it. Because of the sweeping nature of the state's criminal asset forfeiture laws and the federal oversight triggered by the initial bank intrusion alerts, a sweeping judicial freeze was slammed across every single bank account, commercial holding, shell company, and investment portfolio bearing Ethan's name. The liquidity he pretended to have vanished overnight. The high-end luxury vehicles leased under his corporate entity were repossessed from the driveway. The banking institutions that had extended him unsecured lines of credit based on inflated collateral values instantly called their notes. Within 48 hours of his arrest, the business partners, institutional investors, and high-net-worth contractors who had previously fawned over his charm fled like rats from a sinking ship. They canceled every pending development contract, pulled their capital out of his commercial shell corporations, and publicly distanced themselves from his name. The glass tower he had built on a foundation of debt, deception, and the anticipated inheritance of his mother's blood shattered completely. The great real estate developer was left with nothing: no money, no partners, no freedom, and no way out. The ledger of his life had finally been audited, and the bottom line was absolute, unmitigated ruin. Sitting quietly in my study miles away, watching the digital news alerts stream across my computer monitor, I felt neither joy nor triumph. There is a profound, chilling quiet that settles over a room once the storm has finally broken. I watched live footage of the local news vans parked outside my son's grand suburban house, filming as federal marshals carried out boxes of financial documents, hard drives, and confiscated ledgers. The neighbors were standing on their lawns, whispering behind their hands, staring at the sudden spectacle of a family collapsing under the weight of its own greed. It was the exact outcome mathematics and law had dictated from the beginning. Yet looking at the screen, the silence in my own home felt heavier than ever. The trap had closed, the law had been served, and the illusion was gone forever.
The courtroom at Marion County was packed to the wooden benches with local reporters, curious neighbors, and financial analysts when the gavel finally came down. For weeks, Ethan's defense attorneys had tried every procedural trick in the book, attempting to challenge the cryptographic authenticity of my cloud logs and arguing that the basement security footage constituted an unlawful wiretap. But forensic auditing leaves no shadows for lawyers to hide in. When the prosecution presented the unbroken digital chain of custody alongside the physical wrench recovered from his garage, complete with his palm prints and thermal DNA, the legal facade crumbled. Faced with a mountain of unassailable evidence and the devastating itemized testimony provided by his own wife, Ethan's defense team surrendered. They advised him that taking a plea deal was his only remaining option to avoid the maximum penalty of life without parole. The air inside the courthouse hallway had been thick with tension for days, smelling faintly of old paper, floor wax, and the quiet desperation of people whose lives had unraveled in public. Outside on the stone steps, news crews jostled for position beneath towering camera tripods, shouting questions and broadcasting live feeds to screens across the state. But inside Department 4, beneath the stern portrait of the county's founding judges, time seemed to slow to a crawl. This was the final chapter of a ledger that had taken decades to compile, and every single entry was about to be audited down to the final cent. For months, Ethan's high-priced legal team had fought a desperate rearguard action. They had filed motion after motion, trying to suppress the encrypted cloud backups, claiming the timestamp hashes were manipulated, and arguing that a mother's remote surveillance grid violated civil privacy expectations. But mathematics and forensic science do not bend to clever legal arguments. When the digital forensics expert appointed by the court took the stand, he dismantled every single objection, point by point, proving that the chain of custody from my basement camera to the remote off-site server was as absolute and immutable as the laws of physics. Faced with an airtight prosecution and realizing that his wife had already traded every secret they shared for a reduced sentence, Ethan's expensive lawyers finally ran out of miracles. They spent the morning huddled in the corner of the holding alcove, whispering urgently, before Ethan finally nodded with a defeated, vacant expression. There would be no dramatic trial with closing arguments and jury deliberations. The math was simply too heavy to carry. When the judge re-entered the courtroom, the rustle of clothes and nervous whispers instantly died away into absolute silence. The proceedings were brisk, clinical, and devoid of any theatrical grace. Ethan stood beside his attorney, his posture slumped inside a standard orange jumpsuit that swallowed his broad shoulders. When asked if he understood the terms of the negotiated plea agreement, his voice came out dry and cracked, barely audible over the hum of the overhead ventilation system. He pled guilty to first-degree attempted murder with documented premeditation and criminal conspiracy. The judge did not mince words when delivering the sentence. He spoke of the sacred trust broken between parent and child, of premeditated malice disguised as domestic affection, and of the absolute necessity of protecting society from calculated greed. The gavel fell with a sharp, echoing crack that seemed to fracture the remaining illusion of our family name. 25 years in a maximum security state correctional facility, without the possibility of early parole. He would enter prison in his prime and leave as an old man if he survived the concrete blocks at all. Melissa's sentencing followed immediately afterward. Because her voluntary confession and extensive documentation had mapped out the entire conspiracy, from the Stalin Christmas passwords to the choice of the gas line, the prosecution honored the terms of her cooperation agreement. She received 10 years of supervised felony probation, 500 hours of mandatory community service, and strict geographic restrictions barring her from contacting any member of my estate. As she walked out of the courtroom with her divorce lawyer, keeping her head ducked low beneath a wide-brimmed hat, her polished socialite armor looked remarkably pathetic, a cheap plastic shell stripped of every luxury she had plotted to steal. Then came the final moment of the docket. The bailiffs signaled for Ethan to be moved. As he was uncuffed from the courtroom table and refastened with heavy steel wrist strains, he was directed down the aisle toward the secure lower holding corridor. As he passed the wooden gallery where I sat alone in the front row, he slowed his pace for a fraction of a second. He turned his head and looked directly at me. His eyes were red-shot, rimmed with the raw panic of a man who had finally realized that no amount of charm or financial engineering could buy his way out of concrete walls. He looked at me with a desperate, silent pleading, searching for a trace of the mother who had once kissed her scraped knees and celebrated her childhood birthdays. It was a look designed to evoke pity, to remind me of the baby he once was,
and to beg for a lifeline in the middle of a storm he manufactured himself. I did not flinch, and I did not look away. My spine remained straight, my hands folded quietly in my lap. There were no tears left to shed. Grief is a fire that eventually consumes all its fuel, leaving behind only white ash and cold stone. I looked back at him not with anger, but with the profound, quiet detachment of an auditor who has finished closing an insolvent account. The ledger was balanced, the fraud was exposed. As the guards pulled him forward and the heavy steel door swung shut with a dull, final thud, the courtroom finally emptied into the quiet afternoon light. I stood up, smoothed down the lapels of my coat, and walked out into the open air of Marion County. The trap was sprung, the debt was paid, and for the first time in my life, the silence around me was completely, beautifully my own.
Months slipped away, blending into the quiet rhythm of the changing seasons. The sharp edge of the nightmare dulled, replaced by the steady hum of a life slowly stitching itself back together. Then, an envelope arrived in the mail. It bore the heavy, austere stamp of the state penitentiary. I looked at it, lying there on the wooden foyer table. My reflection stared back at me through the glass pane of the front door, steady, unyielding. I didn't tear it open with trembling hands, and I didn't throw it away. I picked it up, walked over to the kitchen, and slid it neatly into the bottom drawer of the refrigerator, right beneath the vegetable crisper, burying it in the cold dark. I didn't need to read it. There are answers in this life that arrive far too late to change the landscape of anything. What he had to say could no longer touch the person I had become. Outside, the world was greening. Ruth, my neighbor, whose quiet steadfastness had been an anchor through the worst of the squall, knocked on the back door one Tuesday morning with a pair of pruning shears and a sack of soil. Together, we set to work on the overgrown plot in the backyard, the neglected patch of earth my late husband had once loved with his whole heart. We dug up the dead briars, turned the stubborn earth, and planted new rose canes. It wasn't about erasing the past or pretending the thorns had never pierced deep into my flesh. It was about choice. We shaped that garden into a living testament, a quiet declaration that beauty could and would grow from the ashes of betrayal. Every petal that unfurled under the spring sun felt like a quiet pulse of new life. Sitting on the porch step as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of amber and soft violet, Ruth handed me a cup of tea. We didn't talk about him. We didn't need to. The silence between us wasn't empty anymore. It was full of a hard-won peace. People often ask me how I managed to look the world in the eye again, how the bitterness didn't hollow me out entirely. But standing there in the garden, watching the wind rustle through the fresh green leaves, I finally understood the truth of it. Trust is never about making sure you are never lied to, never deceived, never hurt again. That is an illusion. True trust is the quiet, terrifying courage to dare to open the door of your heart one more time, fully knowing the storm, yet stepping out into the light anyway.
Before we say goodbye, I want to talk to you for just a moment. Wherever you are right now, what city are you sitting in, and what time is it on your clock as you watch this? Let me know in the comments below so I can see just how far this story traveled to reach you. More importantly, looking at this story, what is the biggest lesson you are taking away today? Is it about the strength to stand back up when everything is stripped away, the courage to walk away from toxic bonds, or the realization that human dignity and self-respect can never be bought with a price tag? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one, and I would love to know how this resonated with you. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next story. Thank you so much for watching. Stay strong, protect your peace, and I will see you in the next video.